Good morning, General. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, good morning, Jason. Thanks for the privilege.
Sir, perhaps you could tell us a few words about yourself and your own background.
So I was in the Army for 38 years. My last two jobs in the Army were as commander of NATO Allied Land Command from 2012 to 14. I'm based in Izmir, Turkey. And then from 2014 to 2017, I was the commander of U.S. Army Europe. After retiring, I worked at SEPA, Center for European Policy Analysis, and then this summer I transitioned from SEPA to Human Rights First, where I am a senior advisor, and I'm also the NATO senior mentor for logistics.
So that's very interesting. In the context of that, tell me, why is this war so important, and what's the role of human rights in all of this?
So, what's happening in Ukraine is not just about Ukraine. This is about um, this international rules-based order, which is a mouthful and people use it a lot. But what does it mean? It means respect for human rights. It means respect for international law. It means respect for sovereignty of borders. All these things that we worked so hard to create after the Second World War, and from which the West, almost more than anybody, benefits. That's what's at stake here. If Russia is allowed to just trample over that, to be rewarded by keeping territory that they seized illegally, and if they're not held accountable for the murder of thousands of innocent people, and we're watching it every day now, rockets and missiles flying into apartment buildings, civilian infrastructure, not to mention everything that's happened in the months before now. And of course, the deportation of thousands of Ukrainian children into Russia. This is a huge stack of war crimes. Russia has to be held accountable. Otherwise, the Chinese will not be too impressed with anything we say either. And then finally, America's prosperity depends on European prosperity, and European prosperity depends on stability and security. So we have a lot at stake in this conflict.
You've been very public that the U.S. should be doing more for Ukraine. At the same time, in 2014, you were with the U.S. military in Europe when the invasion began against Ukraine. Can you give us some insight as to why the U.S. took the decisions they took and did not become more active in supporting Ukraine to fight back the Russian invasion at that point?
As I've looked back over what happened, why didn't we do more? And the Russians, of course, made some serious strategic miscalculations, to include number one, that they would roll over Ukraine, and number two, that the West would not really care, that we would not intervene, that they would be able to peel off Ukraine from the rest of us. And they have good reason for believing that, because we did nothing after they invaded Georgia in 2008. Not really. We did basically nothing after they invaded Ukraine in 2014 and annexed Crimea. We did nothing after they supported the Assad regime when it jumped over President Obama's red line about using chemical weapons. And so all of these things where we failed to act, where we, first of all, I think the collective, we just couldn't believe that Russia would actually invade another European country. We were overly concerned about nuclear, Russia escalating using nuclear weapons. We lacked confidence, and I think also because of how Afghanistan ended, and our own internal domestic problems in the previous administration, we never had a strategy for the Black Sea region, and that's not limited to one administration. I mean, just like Afghanistan covered 4 or 5 different administrations, so does our failure to have a strategy for the Black Sea region. And so I think all of these things contributed to it. The height of the strategic discussion about Ukraine was whether or not to give javelin. And we talk about Ukraine as if it was an island. That's where we were back in 2014.
Well, today things are much different. We're giving a lot of aid, and you suggest we should give more aid. Could you explain perhaps what type of aid we should be giving and what the relevance is? Why this type of aid specifically?
Well, first of all, we need to decide that we want Ukraine to win, that Ukraine winning is to our benefit. And I don't understand why there's been a reluctance to say we want them to win. I've heard really good people say we want Russia to lose. We want Ukraine to be successful, but they can't bring themselves to say the words, we want Ukraine to win, to defeat Russia. Now, part of that is because I think an awful lot of people, good, smart people, just can't get their heads around the idea that Russia actually can be defeated and is going to be defeated. That's after decades of the Soviet Union and Cold War and all of that. There's a sort of a deference that's given to Moscow that would never be given to anybody else that was doing the same types of things that they do. But that's where we are. So because of that, we haven't made the decision that we're going to do everything, whatever it takes to make sure Ukraine wins. Now, to the credit of the administration, they have done a very good job of keeping this coalition of allies and partners together. The Ramstein contact group of 50 nations meets again next week to talk about the next round of what's going to be provided. And I think we have to talk capabilities. I prefer to talk capabilities instead of specific systems because if you talk capabilities, there may be two or three different ways to get at the same capability without getting bogged down in detailed arguments about what particular kind of thing is there. And the capabilities that the Ukrainians need, obviously, is the ability to protect their populations and their critical infrastructure from Russian attack. They need the capability, long range precision strike, to be able to continue to go after Russian headquarters, Russian logistics, and especially to be able to isolate Crimea. They need the ability to make Crimea untenable for Russian forces. And they also need the ability, in a related vein, similar vein, to deny Russia sanctuary. And right now, Russia has sanctuary because we have limited the range of weapons that we're willing to give them to the 90 kilometers of the HIMARS GMLRS rocket. So everything beyond that is, in effect, sanctuary for Russia, including Crimea. So those are the capabilities that I think are most important. And right behind that, of course, is the capability to conduct mobile offensive operations. So armored vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, tanks, artillery that can move with it.
So you say that we give a lot of deference to Russia, which we would not give to other countries, and a lot of that has been said to true to be also the case in the Soviet period that the U.S. Created a paper tiger, that the Soviet power was so great and its military was so strong. When you look at what's going on today, do you think that the quality of the Russian military itself, the officers, for instance, is their training at the level that is so far below that of the West? And how would you qualify the military leadership of the Russian Federation?
I'm embarrassed at how much I overestimated Russia's capabilities back before February. Of course, I mean, the whole time I was at Landcom in Izmir and then at U.S. Army Europe, we were looking every day trying to understand what do they have, what are they doing, where are they. Um, what I failed to realize that even though they had a large force and they were spending tons of money on modernization, or so we thought, what I failed to realize was the depth of corruption and how much of that money was actually going into paying for the nice residence of Minister Shoigu instead of proper tires for vehicles or proper rations for soldiers or good body armor or quality helmets and all those kinds of things. So of course, I always assumed there was a degree of corruption out there. That would not surprise anybody. But the depth of the corruption and the way it has manifested itself in total lack of readiness of so many things, equipment and storage, mobilization systems, just not there. And then I think they never had as many soldiers as they claimed to. Again, this is another manifestation of corruption. When you say, I have 100,000 soldiers that have to be paid, and you actually only have 70 or 80,000, that's a great way to make a lot of money, which is a classic skimming opportunity. And the quality of their modernization has been trash. But again, this is where vendors can pay off whoever is responsible for quality control, for example. Um, it's so this corruption was something that I did not anticipate. The second thing that I missed, um, the level of readiness. I had assumed that lots and lots of Russian forces were involved in operations, Syria, Africa, in 2014 in Crimea, in 2008 But as it turns out, probably only about 5 to 10% of the Russian military was ever actually on operation. And so, and if you don't do tough, rigorous exercises where you train to the point of failure and then fix it, if you don't have a culture like that, then you will never ever. And if you don't have a real operational experience, then you will never develop the real capabilities needed to be successful in modern sustained combat. So all those things we saw happening in February, March, April, May, the terrible logistics, the failure to do any joint operations where you had air-ground integration, for example. Um, as far as leader development and officer training, I had always believed that the general staff officers were well educated, and I think they are. But they're educated at what? As you know, and most of your readers will know, the lack of no, the command structure that's there, and the command philosophy of a very centralized system, and you get promoted by making no mistakes, and by uh, not bringing a lot of bad news. So it's So with all those kind of things, that's a long list of excuses by me of why I was so wrong about their ability.
Well, when you look at what happened in the past couple of days, Valery Gerasimov has been asked to take over the special operation, as they call the invasion of Ukraine. What do you read into that? Why do you think that happened, or what does it say about what's really going on inside of the war?
Three things come to mind. The first thing is that this is a recognition by the Kremlin that that they're failing. I mean, to have a major shakeup like this with a new commander having only been in post for 3 months, it's acknowledgement that they are falling well short of the objectives of the special military operation. So that's a big part of it. The second thing that is worth thinking about is how is it after 11 months almost that they still have not figured out how to establish a coherent command structure that has that can achieve unity of command, which is one of the principles of war from centuries. We know you have to have that, and to get the best effect out of a very large force with a lot of modern capabilities. And thankfully, they have still not figured out how to do that. And I think it just cuts across the grain of their culture, of the military, and all these other so many different facets of it. And then that goes to the third thing that really this change of command or shakeup or restructuring has highlighted is the turf wars and the internal struggles for power and influence inside the Kremlin and inside the Russian elites. I'm not a Kremlinologist. I don't claim to be an expert on Russia, but it looks to me that Shoigu and Gerasimov, who I was sure were both going to be sacked within the last 5 or 6 months. I mean, Shoigu's been the defense minister for 10 years. Gerasimov's been there forever. And their responsibility performed terribly. How are they still in their jobs? And I think it goes to, they don't bring bad news and they are incredibly loyal to Vladimir Putin. I think Surovikin probably who was not picked for his charming personality, was willing to give bad news. And of course, he got the withdrawal out of Kherson, and various other things have not gone well. In the meanwhile, you've got Mr. Prigozhin, who I think sees himself either as the savior of the Kremlin or the successor, is out there very publicly criticizing Shoigu and Gerasimov, and saying it was only his soldiers are their true best soldiers, and he would have been successful faster if he hadn't been screwed over by the general staff and the military. So you've got all this going on, and then you've got Kadyrov, the leader of the Chechens, who I think is kind of sitting on the sidelines doing push-ups on TV, but not too many Chechens are getting killed. not like otherwise. And I think he is biding his time as well. So those are three takeaways for me in the early days after this new restructuring. I don't know how Gerasimov, who looks like he's 1 foot in the grave already, how he can be the chief of the general staff and all that that entails, and be the day-to-day operational commander. This is going to be interesting to watch.
So, knowing all this, seeing all this play out, how much of a risk is there today, do you think, to NATO posed by Russia?
The big risk is that if we don't stop them now, then and if they're allowed to keep Crimea, say, and we come up with some negotiated settlement, and then as usual we lose interest very quickly and move on to other things, then in 2, 3, or 4 years you and I'll be having this conversation again about how they've started over, and then I think they will feel emboldened that they could, after they've rebuilt, that they will in fact continue with doing what they said they have done, what they have said they will do, and that would be Baltic countries or something like that. So now you're talking about a NATO conflict.
So, what is your prognosis? How does the war play out? How does this finish? When does this finish?
So actually, I'm an optimist. We know that war is a test of will, it's a test of logistics, and clearly the Ukrainian soldiers and the Ukrainian people have superior will to the Russian soldiers and the Russian people. The test of will between the Kremlin and Western capitals is a very important part of this. And I think if all of us stick together and continue to support Ukraine with everything we said we're going to do, and if we continue to climb up the steps of I wish it wasn't so incremental, but at least if we get to where we provide ATACMS, for example, that long range precision capability I talked about, or some drones, then I think that Ukraine has the ability to liberate Crimea by the end of August this year. Crimea is actually quite vulnerable. The Black Sea Fleet is terrified of Ukrainian anti-ship missiles and drones, so they're hardly a factor. There are 2 roads that lead to the Crimean Peninsula, one over the Kerch Bridge, which has already been severely damaged, and then the so-called land bridge that runs along the coast of Azov Sea. And the Ukrainians have already been able to hit targets in Melitopol, even with the shorter range HIMARS that they have. And so I imagine over the next 2 to 3 months, the Ukrainian General Staff is going to continue doing what it's been doing, this methodical, disciplined, uh, brilliant operational design, and they're going to isolate Crimea. And eventually they're going to be able to get HIMARS and other systems close enough to be able to make Crimea untenable for Russian forces, where they would have to leave airfields, ammunition, ships. So Crimea really starts looking like a trap.
General, I really hope that you're right. Thank you so much, time, for coming to talk to us today.
Well, it was a real privilege, Jason. I thank you.
Thank you, sir.